Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session about the brain and different studies regarding complex systems. My name is Panos Bamidis. I'm a professor at the School of Medicine at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and I'll be chairing this session. There will be 3 presentations on this session, and we already see the first presenter, Joel Hochstetter, who will be talking about complex dynamics that emerge from disorder in neuromorphic nanowire networks, if I read it correctly. Joel, the floor is all yours. You have 15 minutes to present.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. Hi. Can you hear this?
Joel.
Okay. All right.
And today I'm going to talk to you about how complex dynamics emerge from disorder in neuromorphic nanowire networks. If you think about a computer chip, that it has an ordered, intricate, finely tuned structure, which is in direct contrast to the brain, which has a highly disordered structure with many random connections between neurons. And the brain does not process information like a computer either. The brain processes information through diverse dynamics such as wave-like activity or also irregular states where you have periods of activity followed by periods of quiet. And one particular state in the brain that is thought to be important to its information processing is a state known as criticality. And this is when the brain operates near the edge of a phase transition. And so to think about criticality, we can think about activity propagating through a network. So if we have a subcritical state, then each activity at a given node will on average trigger events at less than one other node. And so activity will die out and only propagate locally. Whereas the supercritical state, activity at one node will trigger more than one node to be active and will lead to the network being overwhelmed. Whereas the critical state, one node on average triggers one other node. And this leads to the response of the network on a range of scales. So perturbations can trigger small responses or large responses known as avalanches. And it's found that in cortical networks that avalanche sizes and avalanche lifetimes follow power laws. And this is suggestive of criticality. And while this is a controversial hypothesis and isn't totally worked out yet, it's quite a popular hypothesis for the reasons that criticality is thought to optimize information processing in neural networks, such as optimizing things like the dynamic range in response to stimuli or the mutual information. And more broadly, the information processing in dynamical systems is often found to be optimized near the critical point of a phase transition. And so now I introduce you to the focus of my talk. And this is a neuromorphic network of silver nanowires. So each of the white lines corresponds to a tiny silver wire of a few nanometers in diameter and several microns in length. And these nanowires self-assemble into some kind of complex disordered structure, unlike a computer chip and more like a brain that has some similar topological characteristics such as small wellness and modularity, similar to the brain. And at the crossing points between the nanowires is an electrochemical junction. So on the left and the right, you have silver nanowires separated by an electrically insulating, ionically conducting PVP polymer layer. And if you apply a voltage to these junctions, then a silver filament, which is in the middle here, can grow through the layer. And this changes the electrical conductance of the layer or the junction by orders of magnitude. And because the growth of this filament depends on the path memory to stimuli, and it also controls signal transduction through these junctions, that these junctions can be considered synthetic synapses in our network. So these networks both have a disordered structure inspired by the brain and also the synaptic liking elements inspired by the brain. And our group has been utilizing these networks for brain-inspired information processing tasks. And so we've done static tasks such as handwritten digit recognition, but we're more interested in dynamic time-varying tasks like chaotic time series prediction. But if we're wanting to understand how to optimize these networks to perform certain information processing tasks, then we want a better understanding into the dynamics in the network, and particularly the collective dynamics in the network, and understand whether we can produce collective dynamical states like having networks operate at criticality. And the way that we probe their dynamics is we stimulate the networks either in experiment or a simulation with a voltage bias across the network. And one interesting feature that's been found experimentally is the existence of 1-on-F power spectrum. And power law power spectrum is suggested that the network might be at criticality, but is very much not conclusive, as lots of different ways can produce 1-on-F power spectrum. So I've investigated this further, but first we need to develop a model. And the way we model these networks is we model the nanowires as sticks that are randomly placed on a 2D grid. And these sticks have random lengths drawn by a gamma distribution. And then we map this nanowire representation onto a graph representation where we say that the nanowires are nodes, the junctions are time-varying resistive edges, and we say that the whole network is an electrical network which follows Kirchhoff's laws. And to model the junctions, we model them as threshold memristors, and we describe it with a filament parameter lambda, and we say that the filament parameter grows if the voltage is bigger than a certain threshold, and the filament parameter shrinks if the voltage is smaller than another threshold. And if the filament parameter changes, passes a certain value or becomes close to that value, then the conductance of the junction jumps by orders of magnitude, which is shown in blue. And so the easiest way to probe these networks, or the most simple stimulation we can use, is just to apply a constant voltage bias across these networks. And when we do this in both simulation and experiment, and look at the conductance time series, which is the y-axis, at different voltages, which are the different curves, then we see that below a certain voltage, the network stays in a low conductance state in both simulation and experiment. And if you go above this critical voltage, then the network conductance jumps by orders of magnitude. So the network undergoes a phase transition from a low conductance to a high conductance state. And I guess one of the features of in experiment, and it's most notable in simulation because we can use smaller networks, is these kinds of step-like behavior at the junction in the network conductance. And this can be related to junction switching. So I'll now show you a short video. And the color of the edges corresponds to the conductance of the junctions. And you can see that we have these transitions to blue-green colors, followed by periods of quiet. And when we have a transition, we have several junctions, or one or several junctions will transition collectively together. And this kind of collective transitions where you have certain events trigger other events is suggestive of an avalanche analysis. So we can analyze the avalanches like it's done in the brain to see whether any of the states are consistent with criticality. And the way we can do this is we can define an event as when the change in conductance divided by the conductance at a given junction is bigger than a certain threshold, and comes back below that threshold, then we define that as event. And then we discretize time into time bins, which we just do as the average inter-event interval, so the average time between consecutive events. And we define an avalanche as consecutive bins which contain events preceded and followed by bins that don't contain events, like done in studies of avalanches in the brain. And so the avalanche lifetime is the number of bins in the avalanche, and the avalanche size is the total number of events that fall within those bins. And when we do that, we can probe the statistical distributions of the avalanches in both simulation and experiment. And what we find is power laws in the avalanche size distribution, the avalanche lifetime distribution, and the avalanche average size as a function of lifetime in both simulation and experiment. And this is suggestive of criticality, but power laws alone are not sufficient. So what we need to do is we need to look at the exponents of the power laws, and we find that the exponents of the power laws obey the Kreckling noise relationship, which is suggestive that these dynamics may be at the critical point of a phase transition. So these suggest that at the critical voltage, at least, these networks can exhibit critical dynamics, which is good, because if we can keep it near the state, then these networks can perhaps perform optimally in information processing. But to understand the networks a bit further, we need to go beyond constant voltage drivings. And now we look at a periodic signal. So in this case, I look at a triangular wave. And the way we have quantified the dynamics of these states is with the Lyapunov exponent. And if you're not familiar with it, it works kind of like this. So you consider a small perturbation to a state. And for a chaotic state, the perturbation will grow in time, whereas has a positive Lyapunov exponent, whereas a negative Lyapunov exponent, the perturbation will shrink over time, and eventually two nearby states will end up together, and the edge of the chaos when the size of the perturbation is maintained. And when we do this for these networks, we find that by controlling the amplitude and the frequency of the periodic driving signal, then we can transition the networks from ordered dynamics characterized by a negative Lyapunov exponent in black through the edge of chaos in purple in the middle to chaotic dynamics, which are shown in yellow. So these networks can exhibit a range of dynamics that weren't possible in DC or a constant voltage when you use these periodic driving signals. And you can see an example of some of the trajectories here: an ordered trajectory and a chaotic trajectory where the network exponentially diverges on adjacent cycles. And then we can test the performance in a framework known as reservoir computing, where we, in a task known as nonlinear waveform transformation, where we input a triangular wave into the network, and we take readouts of voltages from the network, and then we linearly train these readouts into a sine wave, a square wave, and also a double frequency triangular wave and a phase shifted triangular wave. And when we do this, we find that the information processing given by the accuracy is optimized when we use network states where the Lyapunov exponent is close to zero. And this is most notable by looking at the mean accuracy. And this is suggestive that maybe being close to the critical point of a transition gives optimal processing, like is seen in the brain. And actually, it's quite interesting that if you retry these avalanches and you retry the chaotic analysis on a ordered square lattice network, you see that you lose these dynamics. So you no longer see scale-free avalanches if you do avalanche statistics, and you see that if you start, independent of the initial conditions, you start the network in, you only get stable attractors. You don't get chaotic dynamics or edge of chaos dynamics on stable lattices. And so this is what I'm investigating at the moment, and for future work, trying to understand how the role of the network disorder plays in the complex dynamics that we see in these networks, and also investigating to see whether we can see other brain-like states and see whether we can utilize these networks for more information processing tasks. So I'd like to thank you for listening to my talk, and please get in touch by email or over Twitter if you have any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for keeping the time and for this presentation, which is now open for discussion. Are there any questions?
Yes. Hello, Joel. May I ask you a question?
Sure.
So a lot of what I do is reservoir computing in the context of attractor embedding. So you drive the reservoir with, say, a chaotic signal, and then you just train outputs to reconstruct the inputs. And then you perform feedback. So you drive the system now with the outputs that mimic the inputs. I'm wondering if you think that these nanowire structures would be able to self-evolve about a chaotic attractor, as a lot of computational work in reservoir computing does.
So we've, I think that it may be possible, but we it requires, I guess, a bit more investigation into. So we've done some simple kind of reservoir computing tasks. Like, I guess the closest we've done to what you described is we tried the Mackie glass chaotic time series prediction task. But I think in terms of what, like you described, it requires a little bit more work, especially to get implemented experimentally before we can do this.
I see. Thank you.
Any other question?
Yes, I have a question.
Please.
I arrived a bit late. I'm not sure. Have you showed the shape of the? Are there some kind of spikes? How do you? I mean, the one you are using as Avalanche is a set of raster plots, right, with activities. So those points in the raster plot are what, spikes?
Yes. So what we find is if we look at the, for example, like the conductance time series at junctions, is that the conductance abruptly changes between different metastable values. And so you can consider it like spikes because it's changing over a very short period of time and then it's going flat. So if you either look at the voltage or the conductance, then it can be considered like a spike, and then you can produce it.
So, but you haven't, you know, assemble something like a temporal series, right?
Pardon?
Have you assembled something like a temporal series with that information? Do you have a temporal series to show?
I don't have one in this presentation. Sorry.
I will be very happy to see something like that. Thanks.
If you give me your email, I can send you some more if you're interested.
Good. I will send it. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Nice talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Last question, if is there any question? Joel, did you find the example that you started with from epilepsy and the related life sciences related one inspiring for your modeling, or you are targeting through these modeling of nanowires and the computer network kind of approach to be eventually applied to disorders like epilepsy, for example?
I didn't quite get the first part of the question. What did you mean by that?
So you showed the relevance with discharges that happen in the brain, etc.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Are you inspired to model? Are you inspired from these to model your work in reservoir computing and computer communications, or you are targeting to end up in that application?
So I guess it's kind of loosely inspired by that. I guess we have in our networks, our end goal is more to develop some kind of information processing device that's brain inspired, and so we've looked for some loose inspiration from different areas applied to neuroscience and applied to other studies of complex networks. So we've done some studies of like the functional connectivity and the structural connectivity, and we're like looking to apply these areas to use these networks to moving towards those kinds of applications.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. We'll proceed to the next one, which is now taking us to uncovering the relative effects of modifiable risk factors in Alzheimer's disease prevention. And they will present a systems modeling approach. I guess Jeroen Uleman will do the presentation.
Yes. Yes. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll I have a video, so I'll play that first, and then I'm open to take any questions. Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
My name is Jeroen Uleman, and I am a computational scientist and PhD student at the Geriatrics Department of the Radboud University Medical Center and the UVA Institute for Advanced Study. Today, I will discuss my recent and ongoing work on developing an individualized system dynamics model to prevent Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common type of dementia and has a huge personal and societal and economic burden. Research into Alzheimer's disease is complicated by its complexity. It involves many different causal factors at several different scales of biological organization in space as well as time. What's more, these different causes interact dynamically and often non-linearly, in part through feedback mechanisms. For example, abnormal aggregation of proteins and neural inflammation can result in neuronal dysfunction, which disrupts brain connectivity and leads to cognitive decline. This, in turn, can lead to disruptions in social relationships, which can then cause further cognitive decline. Now, since there aren't any disease-modifying treatments available, preventing the disease by timely intervention on several of these factors is crucial. Luckily, prevention seems promising. A recent landmark study suggests that 40% of dementia incidents can be potentially prevented through the elimination of 12 modifiable risk factors, such as depression, hypertension, and hearing loss. However, actual preventive intervention trials, which have targeted multiple of these risk factors, have shown inconsistent results. I believe this suggests that we need to better understand, firstly, the causal effects of these risk factors, and secondly, who needs to receive which intervention when, in order to know how to maximize the effect of these interventions for each individual. We aim to address both of these points using an individualized system dynamics model, where the system of risk factors is simulated over time for each individual. Now, how do we develop such a system dynamics model? Well, this is the typical modeling and simulation cycle. We start with a conceptual model that is based on domain knowledge and/or data. From this conceptual model, we develop a computational model, which can then be used to simulate the phenomenon and then be validated. Once validated, such a model can be used to test new hypotheses, such as whether a certain preventive intervention on multiple risk factors actually works. Finally, if promising, we can go back to experiments and conduct targeted trials to gain further evidence for our hypotheses and actually try to help patients. The typical conceptual model used for system dynamics is the causal loop diagram, which is what we will focus on. What is a causal loop diagram? A causal loop diagram is a network that is characterized by nodes and directed causal links. These links have a positive or negative polarity, meaning that when they change, their successor changes in the same or opposite direction. A distinct feature of causal loop diagrams is the feedback loop, which can either be reinforcing, resulting in exponential growth or decay, or balancing, which results in a return to the previous state. Now, you can develop such a diagram in multiple ways, but we've decided to use group model building, in which we met with 15 experts in Alzheimer's disease twice to gradually develop this diagram. During these sessions, we aim to map out the most important risk factors and causal mechanisms in Alzheimer's disease from midlife onwards. Variables and causal links were only added if all experts agreed on their inclusion. And we also conduct a literature review to validate the links in the diagram. Now, this causal loop diagram is the end product. The red causal links relate to brain health, whereas the yellow links and variables or nodes relate to physical health, and the green to psychosocial health. Feedback loops here are annotated with RD or RI for reinforcing direct and indirect feedback loops respectively. Now, of course, it's great to have a diagram like this, but it's quite difficult to develop a computational model with so many nodes and edges from the get-go. And so we first wanted to develop a proof of concept model, for which we used the ODNI dataset, which contains a sensitive scale for measuring cognitive dysfunction, the ADAS. It contains ATN biomarkers, which include abnormal protein aggregation and neuronal dysfunction. And the dataset also contained 10 out of 12 of the modifiable risk factors from the previously mentioned landmark study by Livingston. And for this first proof of concept system dynamics model, we assumed that these risk factors are exogenous constants, and their values at baseline affect the biomarkers and cognitive functioning over time. And this is the conceptual model that we use to develop our proof of concept, SDM. As I said, cognitive dysfunctioning, FDG PET, and protein aggregation or amyloidosis are the stocks, They're the endogenous structure of the model, and they are modeled as difference equations describing how they change over time. The risk factors we used are social isolation, which is imperfectly proxied as being married or not, depressive symptoms, smoking, diabetes, obesity, traumatic brain injury, hypertension, education, ApoE4 carriership, which is an important genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, excessive alcohol use, and hearing loss. However, something that we learned along the way is that the CLD does not contain all the necessary information for writing out a complete computational model yet. We are currently working on a paper to propose several additions to the traditional causal loop diagram that is based on expert knowledge that can then help improve the transition to developing a computational model. This is necessary because the causal loop diagram does not tell us anything about interaction terms between risk factors or whether the edges are linear or nonlinear. And in addition, since we do not have data on every node in the diagram, it's not obvious how many indirect nodes that. For example, if you have this diagram where the green nodes are in the data and the red nodes are not in the data, do we, when we not have oxidative stress, completely omit that entire pathway, or do we replace it by a direct edge? And if we do that, do we then also do that when there are two variables that are not in the data in between? And this is important because the more layers of indirect edges we allow, the more complex the model is going to become. And so we decided to take a more data-driven approach, where we tested several alternative models to one another. Now, these are very preliminary results from just in the past weeks. We decided to look at one very basic model where you have a linear independent effects for each edge and only one layer of indirect edges. Secondly, a more complicated model where we allow two layers of indirect edges, but every edge is still linear and independent. And three, a complex model where we allow nonlinear relationships and interactions, two layers of indirect edges, and then manually pruned the model using the Bayesian information criterion. Now here we can see the plots of 3 years of simulation data. And this is the ADAS scale, so higher is more cognitive dysfunction. You see first the data on the left top, then on the right of it, you see the first model, the basic model, and then on the lower left, you see the complicated model, on the lower right, the more complex model. Now again, these are very preliminary results with very rough parameter and model estimates. But what I think you can see here is that the more complex model is better able to capture the heterogeneity, is better able to capture the few people who really decline very fast in cognitive functioning. We also compared the models using a symmetric mean absolute percentage error. So we used 85% to get the model parameter estimates and 15% of the data to test the models and see if they still generalize well. So these are the results of this validation test, where you see that the third model is better than the second model, which is better than the first model for the training error as well as the test error. But the test error is slightly worse in all models, but follows the same trend. You do see that the training error in model 3 is relatively a little bit lower than the test error, which suggests that there might be some overtraining, which I'm going to further explore, but it's definitely something to be aware of. All right, so finally, the whole reason for this exercise was to get some insight into which risk factors are important to intervene on in individuals to prevent Alzheimer's disease. And so what we do here is basically a local sensitivity analysis, where we look at the change in ADAS, so that's cognitive dysfunctioning, after 3 years if an individual has a standard deviation more of a particular risk factor. So we do it one at a time, not combinations of risk factors for now. And I think two important things to notice here are first, that not all coefficients are in the direction that we expected. So for example, you see that in the third model, BMI and glucose levels are actually protective and they lower the cognitive dysfunction score. The same goes for married, where actually being married is a significant risk factor and increases the ADAS score. And these results may look different in the consequent versions of this model, but they may also be artifacts of selection bias in the data, for example. or reverse causality, which means that it would be beneficial to probably model variables like BMI as endogenous, where they're not only causing the disease, but are also caused by the disease, so that we can properly capture the causal effect of BMI on the disease. Another interesting thing to notice is the standard deviations of these estimates. So you see that in model 1 and model 2, the linear models, there is 0 standard deviation. So they're all just simply additive. What you see in model 3 is that there are large standard deviations, especially, for example, in depressive symptoms, which means that based on this model, you might actually recommend interventions on different risk factors depending on the individual, which is, of course, what we're looking for when we want to create a model that can aid personalized treatments. Now, for future plans, I first want to further the parameter and model form estimation, but then also conduct uncertainty quantification. I'm still thinking how to best limit the model and parameter space, and so any suggestions from the audience are more than welcome. I also want to use additional data sets, for example, to add additional risk factors from the causal loop diagram or biological mechanisms such as oxidative stress and neuroinflammation. And I would also really like to validate the predictions of the model using data from prevention interventions, or eventually even conduct a trial based on the predictions by later versions of this model. And ultimately, but this is still very far-fetched, I would like to couple the model to an agent-based model, for example, to help simulate community-level interventions. Again, I'm very open to any suggestions, and thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any ideas or suggestions, please let me know and let's communicate. You can always email me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very nice presentation. Are there any questions or comments? How do you think these kinds of studies might influence the design of interventions? I can see from your last slide that you can test the validity of these using interventional data, but you mentioned in your abstract, perhaps in your introduction as well, the potential for using these kinds of modeling to drive interventions. How do you think that might happen?
Yeah, so very good question. Thank you. Well, we know that this population is very heterogeneous, and that also what we see in the causal loop diagram is that there are many various pathways that can lead to or contribute to the disease. And so what we think is that there are many different ways that people get this disease. And so also that there are many different ways to target preferentially in an individual the best way of preventing the disease for them. So I now focus specifically on modifiable risk factors, but you could also extend that to other biological mechanisms such as oxidative stress or neuroinflammation. And there are already quite a few of these trials ongoing. We try to personalize treatments for patients. But they're usually still based on quite rough estimations of, okay, this person has hypertension, so they need to lower their blood pressure a little bit. But I think we can do better, and that's what we hope to achieve with this kind of model, is to really maximize the prevention for each individual.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Any other question? I personally have a good interest in this because I'm also employing intervention design systems and try to model data. So I have a lot of data. If you want to testimony any of these models, we can perhaps collaborate.
Oh, that would be very interesting.
Okay, if there is no more question, would like to thank you once again for this nice presentation, and we'll proceed to the next one, which will be done by Alkiviadis-Constantinos Cefalas. And the title of the presentation is The Hypothesis of Quantum Coherent Brain Dynamics and Human Behavior.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Kostas Cefalas, and I'm affiliated with the National Hellenic Research Foundation, Theoretical and Physical Chemistry Institute located in Athens. The current presentation is about the hypothesis of quantum coherent brain dynamics and its relation to human behavior. The hypothesis of quantum coherent brain dynamics is based on the interaction between spatially distributed coherent states and the vector potential of the electromagnetic field. In this picture, the instantaneous coordinating functionalities of different brain areas emerge naturally. Brain functionality and human behavior describes via transitions between three coherent states: a logic state, a block thought state, and a metastage state, which is a superposition of the previous two states. The metastage state is either symmetric or antisymmetric. The transitions between the two states and the metastage and antisymmetric states are forbidden, in agreement with the exciting classical metastable brain theories where metastability is essential for normal behavior. The present talk is organized along three key issues. The first rationalizes the quantum operation of brain and also includes two important points of brain functionality. The first important point is that self-regulating linear cognitive machines bear memory. And the second important point of brain functionality is that human brain have to bypass the complexity versus stability issue. The last is resolved via hierarchical decomposition of networks and is accomplished via quantum coherence. The second key issue is the need of experimental verification of the existence of metastage states in quantum networks and the connection of these states with the quantum brain coherent model. And finally, the third key issue is the interpretation of human behavior and pathology in connection with the classical models. To have scales of the size of information, it is worth to mention that the human brain contains 100 billion cells with 125 trillion synapses and 1 petabyte of processed information. Also, the brain has the capacity of 2.5 petabytes of memory storage, compared with Yahoo's memory capacity of 2 petabytes, and also an 11 million byte volume requirement from sensors. However, on the contrary, the processing capacity required for human control function is 50 bytes per second. Therefore, information in brain is processed over a large dynamic range, and the brain functions logarithmically. Next, a finite state cognitive machine executes a minimal program in outputs of time series of length n, with n1 inputs, where the number of inputs equals with the logarithm of the number of outputs plus the logarithm of the product of outputs with information entropy. Therefore, a cognitive machine in the first order is approximated as a linear control system, taking into consideration the fact that these systems have an invariant element, which is the polynomial part of the Laplace transform of the input-output transfer functions. It is obvious that the functionality of the self-regulated cognitive machine is inherent to memory functionality. It is also known that the linear network, the structural complexity increases with the number of interactive variables, the strength of interconnective and the complexity value. For a number of interactive variables greater than 1 and the strength of interconnection close to 1, the strength of interconnecting amplitudes between the elements of the network at different hierarchical levels strongly depend on small perturbations, and hence, in the absence of stabilization, they follow random distributions. For small complexion values, the system is essentially stable, and hence there exists always a conflict between stability and complexity. Obviously, the conjecture for an unstable brain is not supported by natural evolution. The complexity stability issue is resolved via structural rearrangement of the similar complexity values. The non-zero coupling values between brain systems, units or neurons, are grouped in blocks. The coupling coefficients in red and black in this presentation and in these figures represent strong and weak interactions, respectively. The system is decomposed into non-interactive segregating states, and rearrangements of coupling coefficients couple the two previous segregating states in one by degrading together the previous states. Functional segregation and integration in the brain level are organized on aspects that express autonomy and synergy of the active natural neural networks. Both aspects are enveloped in a metastable regime and refer to the mode of coupling between different brain areas. The normal brain functionality implies that the participating units maintain an intrinsic mode of functionality with the role of metastability to reduce the critical hierarchical coupling between the active neuronal assemblies of object systems, and by allowing them to retain their individuality, specificity, and availability to participate in transient schemes of activation. In this sense, a less determined and more flexible neuronal functioning will enhance the creation of new information. Therefore, mixed segregation integration states point to a quantum mixed states. The important segregation integration process is also viewed in a quantum analog by using the second quantization picture. The active sites are represented as two-level systems, where the creation and annihilation operators raise a lower state to an excited one and a lower the exciting state. The active sites are represented collections of non-interactive uncorrelated oscillators. In a non-interactive picture, the total Hamiltonian of the system is the sum of the individual Hamiltonians. And similarly, the electromagnetic radiation is represented as a collection of individual oscillators where the operators have the usual meaning. In this sense, we have a set of segregating states in the system. If there is interaction between the bosons and photon systems, the two systems fall in one integrating system. Therefore, we have a quantum analog that takes us from segregation to integration, and in the quantum picture, the segregation integration dynamics is fulfilled. The two individual boson segregation states can be cut together via the interactive Hamiltonian. The two separated states form a new coherent state by using the time dose on time ordering operator. Therefore, there exists a natural quantum analog for the segregation interaction process that is required in brain. Let us make this more clear. We start from two integrating low states, and then we proceed to create the algebraic summation of two exciting states. The transitions between symmetric states are allowed. On the contrary, the transitions between the antisymmetric states are forbidden. When the system is in a symmetric state, it fluctuates between the two states. The symmetric state is associated with the pathological thought-blocking states and the auditory verbal states, while the antisymmetric states with metastability, which characterizes normal behavior. The coherent antisymmetric state is inherent with memory functionality and storage of energy and information. In a first-order logic formalism, the mixed quantum state justifies the Turing-Holding problem and the Gödel's incomplete theorems. We proceed now with the experimental verifications of the coherent states. First, the first theoretical verification of long-state coherence in liquids was established in 1988. 50 micrometer spatial distribution of coherent states in the presence of electromagnetic fields were identified in this work. However, no experimental evidence of log ordering existed till the first years of new millennium. An experimental verification of coherent ordering states from a different scientific fields, and particularly from crystallized studies of calcium carbonate under magnetic fields. In these studies, with zero magnetic field, calcium carbonate crystallizes in a tetragonal structure, while in the presence of magnetic fields, calcium carbonate crystallizes in the form of aragonite, having a different structure than calcite. The experimental methodology searches for involves crystallography and transmission electron microscopy by identifying the diffraction side particles. At zero magnetic fields, calcite is formed under the properization of magnetic geometry. Aragonite is formed at low density of the magnetic fields. The questions to be answered here arise from the energy positions of the ground electronic levels of calcite and aragonite molecules, which are separated by 255 Kelvin. Therefore, aragonite is impossible to be formed at room temperature. We have to answer then the question from where the system takes its energy to form the aragonite, and also how the system is stored, how the energy is stored in the system. Classic thermodynamics and electrodynamic methodologies are unable to interpret the process and energy dissipation. Therefore, the quantum mechanical picture that was presented before has to be integrated with the problem, as the shape of a nanostructure requires large range ordering plus energy amplification and storage. The previous issue of application can be viewed under the light of major amplification, which is a coherent process in the microwave spectral region. In the specific configuration, magnetic field Larmor frequencies are inertial with the rotational levels of water, and low-density electromagnetic signals have the potential to be amplified by exchanges energy with the molecular rotors, providing that the energy storage conditions is fulfilled via the coherent and symmetric states. The amplification equation that relates the number of amplified photons with the concentration of the aragonite structures is well fitting to the exponential function of the experimental parameters. Therefore, there is indirect verification of quantum coherent ordering and the formation of long-range antisymmetric states. We choose in the conclusions not to present detailed results and then to give an overall view of the whole picture. So, if I can summarize, the conclusions are the following. The requirements of hierarchical interaction of segregating brain domains to form the required metastable state for normal brain operation is justified by long-range coherent ordering of quantum coherent antisymmetric states. The experimental verification for energy storage amplification of energy in liquids is an indication of long-stage quantum ordering, in agreement with the Ricciardian and Umezaba hypothesis of long-range coherent interaction in human brain. Coherent antisymmetric states and metastability fulfill the requirement of first-order logic and thus human behavior. The quantum coherence approach is also used for the transfer of information in transmembrane integrity networks in cells, which are located in the external membrane, and there are experimental evidence that quantum signal transaction indicates cancer initiation in mammalian cells. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kostas, for this very nice presentation. Are there any questions? Do you see any application in proper human data apart from animal studies or cell samples for this one, that you have an immediate proposal to experiment and test whether the coherent asymmetric states argument that you very nicely presented applies there?
Yes, probably you are aware of the work of Professor Ilias Angelopoulos in the Areterio Hospital in Athens, where he predicted that the metastability is extremely essential for the logic operation of brain, where the block thoughts and the verbal auditory disorder, it means schizophrenia, is associated with the lack of metastability states. In that sense, the quantum coherence and the model of previous model interprets, I will say, the schizophrenia pathology. And I know that there are studies already for implying the above theories in schizophrenic patients. For example, as you see in my presentation, the very weak electromagnetic fields in the microwave region of the spectrum, they can amplify the segregation, integration, operation of the brain, which is one of the most important issues. So, I am not aware at the moment if we have any concluded results, but I know there is still intensive research in this field based on this theory.
Very nice. Is there any other question? If not, we would like to thank you again, Kostas, for this very nice presentation.
Thank you very much.
And we can proceed to the next and the last presenter for this session. The talk will be on space-independent modular structure of brain functional networks, and Francisca Ayres-Ribeiro will be presenting.
Thank you. I will share the screen now. Okay. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Francisca Ayres-Ribeiro, and I'm currently a master's student doing my final thesis on functional brain networks. And in today's presentation, I'm going to focus on these networks' community structure and the underlying special instance. While developing this project, we came across this question. Are functional networks and their topology explained by the special constraints associated to their anatomical placement? And if yes, at what level? This is essentially what we are trying to answer here, and I will give throughout this presentation the main steps of our research, as well as the main conclusions we reached regarding this question. So with this in mind, while searching through literature, we found that several studies in fact show that brain networks are physically constrained by the anatomical space. Besides this, the cost of maintaining the connections between different regions will naturally restrict the complexity and coordination between separate parts of the brain. More specifically, the brain structural connectome has been reported to be influenced by this special embedding, specifically its modular configuration. So again, the question comes as whether the communities extracted now from these functional networks are supported by the brain's geometry, or if there is in fact some additional topology resulting from unexpected connections that will be responsible for the observed complex activity of the brain. So in order to explore this, I will first establish how we obtained these functional networks and then move on to the community analysis performed. We used the resting state fMRI dataset, meaning that there was no stimulus or specific cognitive activity being recorded, and this way capturing only the supposed baseline of brain activity. With this data, we obtained several networks over time, one for each repetition time, that was 1 second, while using the desiccant atlas for the parcellation of the brain cortex into 68 separate regions, which will correspond to the nodes of the network. The edges of these networks were obtained using phase coherence, which is an instantaneous connectivity measure that associates different regions based on their signal phase synchronization. Finally, to remove any spurious connectivity arising from noise, which is typical on this type of resting state datasets, we thresholded these networks while guaranteeing the presence of the giant component for most time points. So with the functional networks defined, we proceeded with a community analysis by first verifying if these specific networks had a modular structure. So first we selected the time points for which the networks deviated from a random case using the standard rewiring null model. And this was done naturally to exclude any time instances that would possibly correspond to noise configurations and therefore lack the clustered topology that we were interested in investigating. As we can see from these plots, where the blue corresponds to the modularity value for the functional networks, and the green corresponds to the modularity value on average, considering all surrogates of the rewiring null model, all time points were deemed significant. And so we applied the Loeffler algorithm to all functional networks, resulting on an average of 6 to 7 communities with a modularity value of 0.69. Having established the cluster structure of these fMRI functional networks, we wondered how much of it was a result of the special constraints, as mentioned before. So we decided to use a special null model that would integrate these special features and thus test their impacts in the structure. Naturally, there are plenty of possibilities for defining this type of null model. However, we decided to use the gravity-based null model recently proposed by Casabet and colleagues. This null model essentially assumes that the probability of existing an edge between two nodes depends on the distance between these two nodes. And this distance dependence is described by a veteran's function. This makes sense and applies to brain networks, as naturally with evolution, the brain developed so as to minimize the distance and costs between the interacting parts, which is necessary so that extensive cognitive processing can be done in an efficient way. An interesting aspect of this special null model is that it's estimated so as to keep the degree distribution of the original network. And this way we can look to the effects of space without concerning about a different topology due to having a distinct degree distribution for the null model. So using this special null model to generate several surrogates for each time point, we computed their modularity over time, leading to an average value of 0.63, which is surprisingly close to the value obtained for our functional networks. So does this mean that the brain topology is only explained by the special constraints? And if so, does this compromise the results regarding functional connectivity, meaning that function is always bounded by structure? Thankfully, no. We found that for most time points, the difference in modularity between the special null model and the functional networks was still statistically significant, as you can see in this plot. Again, the blue corresponds to the modularity value for the functional networks, and the green to the value on average considering all surrogates of the special null model. So this suggests that there is indeed a structure arising from functional necessity beyond these constraints. So in order to extract the communities without this special influence and thus retrieve the models of synchronized functional activity, we applied a modified version of the Loeffler algorithm, also proposed by Casavet and colleagues, for these same selected time points. This algorithm optimized modularity by extending its definition so as to include the special null model instead of the configuration model generally used. And this way, it's possible to obtain the communities regressing out the special influence. With this algorithm, we obtain an average of 6 communities with a modularity of 0.07, which is a small contribution, but not negligible. Furthermore, when comparing the communities obtained with and without the special effects, using the normalized mutual information metric, we found a high similarity between them, though not 100% match for all time points, as we can see. So from these results, we can take several conclusions regarding the community structure captured by functional connectivity data. First, it was possible to verify that the community structure present in these networks is mainly explained by their spatial embedding. This is not entirely surprising, since the geometry of the brain and its anatomical wiring will naturally constrain the neural activity and thus the resulting functional connectivity detected. However, what was surprising was that this effect was found to be quite substantial for these fMRI networks, with some fluctuations over time, naturally. This suggests then that the brain geometry is responsible for most of the functional connections and groups of synchronized activity observed. Besides this, we were still able to find a significant and not negligible community structure beyond these constraints. And in fact, in a very recent study by Cefalas and colleagues, some community structure supported only by long-distance connections was found, which corroborates our findings as well. All of this proves then that indeed some functional connectivity patterns arise out of functional necessity and not just as a consequence of space, even if not at a major extent. So to conclude and answer to the initial questions, are functional networks and their topology explained by special constraints? And if yes, at what level? Yes, the functional network structure is indeed mostly explained by the special embedding, but there is still some significant degree of functional specialization of the community structure, which is space independent. I finalize this presentation by inciting that more work can be done to either verify these findings with different data sets and conditions, or to explore different features beyond the special constraints, such as, for example, with motif mining. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank
Thank you.
you, Francisca,
I hope you can hear me.
Nice presentation, which you try to basically answer a very basic question. I mean, in my language, we say if we didn't look alike or we didn't match, we wouldn't be able to co-opt. And I think that your work tries to identify whether this is true for the brain as well. And you have done well in convincing us that at least there is some evidence and truth behind this statement, and which, you know, originated from the original work of neurosurgeons in Canada at early stages in the 50s. But anyway, my question would be, how much of this would think will be still applied if we didn't go for a resting state, but for excited state, like an experimental design, which would involve some stimuli, etc. So we wouldn't be talking about resting state networks or whatever. How much of that do you think will still apply?
I'm not sure, because I think with resting state data, you normally find structure that you have interactions through different regions of the brain. And with task, it's way more specific. But still, some specific tasks will involve, for example, occipital regions and frontal regions, which are in opposite regions of the brain. So it makes sense that somehow you will have these functional connections that are quite separate, and maybe even a more proeminent structure beyond these constraints than in resting states, which is more bounded to the baseline.
Thank you very much. Any other question or comment that you want to give and provide to Franziska? If not, we would like to thank you again once more for this excellent presentation, and I would like to thank all speakers for the very nice session we just had. And I wish you stay healthy and safe all these difficult days, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.